Before the world called him a billionaire, they called him broken, a man too silent to be understood and too wounded to be loved. In the restless heart of Lagos City, where noise swallowed pain and ambition buried emotion, he moved like a shadow among men who shouted just to prove they existed. He was young, wealthy beyond imagination, a young billionaire whose name carried power in boardrooms, but whose presence felt like absence in human connection. People saw the expensive suits, the sleek cars, the guarded security, but they never saw the storm that lived behind his eyes. To them, he was strange, distant, and cold. To him, he was simply surviving the echoes of a past that refused to release him. Rain had always followed him like a curse, or perhaps like a quiet witness to his pain. On that particular evening, as the clouds broke open above Lagos, he stood alone by the roadside, unmoving despite the heavy downpour soaking his perfectly tailored clothes. It was not carelessness. It was surrender. The rain mirrored everything he could not say: the grief, the silence, the scars carved in his soul by betrayal, abandonment, and a childhood shaped by poverty so deep that even hope had once felt like a luxury he could not afford. Long before he became a wealthy man, he had been a boy who understood hunger, who watched his parents struggle with family sacrifice, who learned early that survival demanded silence. Speaking about pain had never brought him comfort. It had only made him feel smaller. So he learned to bury it. He learned to replace words with walls. And over time, those walls became so strong that even love could not find its way through. Society misunderstood him. They whispered that he was arrogant, emotionless, incapable of true love. They called him weak for not laughing, strange for not speaking, and useless in a world that celebrated loudness over depth. No one asked why. No one waited long enough to understand. And so, he carried his loneliness like a badge no one could see, but everyone judged. Yet destiny, in its mysterious way, had already written a different ending for him. Not far from where he stood that rainy evening, there was a small roadside food shop. Nothing more than a wooden structure covered with a worn-out canopy that barely resisted the rain. The aroma of freshly cooked food drifted into the air, mixing with the scent of wet earth and city dust. Behind that humble setup worked a poor roadside food seller, a simple girl whose life had been defined not by what she lacked, but by what she gave. She was a village girl, new to Lagos, but already shaped by hardship and resilience. Her hands carried the marks of labor, her clothes spoke of modest means, and her daily earnings barely sustained her. Yet there was something about her that defied her circumstances. It was her kindness, her honesty, her unwavering integrity, and above all, her ability to see people, not for their status, but for their souls. Where others saw just another silent rich man standing in the rain, she saw something different. She noticed the way his shoulders carried invisible weight, the way his eyes refused to meet the world, the way his stillness was not pride but pain. In that moment, she understood something that the entire city had failed to see. His silence was not emptiness. It was suffering. She had known suffering too. She had grown up in a place where dreams were fragile and survival was uncertain, where poverty taught lessons no school ever could. But instead of hardening her heart, it had softened it. Instead of breaking her spirit, it had strengthened her faith. She believed in divine favor, in hope, in the idea that even the smallest act of kindness could become a miracle in someone else's life. That belief would lead her to him. As the rain intensified, she stepped out from behind her stall, holding a small, worn umbrella that barely covered her. Each step toward him was quiet but deliberate, as though guided by something greater than instinct, perhaps destiny itself. She did not know his name. She did not know his wealth. She did not know that the man standing before her was a future symbol of billionaire romance and global success. All she knew was that he looked like someone who had been forgotten by the world. "Sir, you will fall sick if you keep standing like this," she said softly, her voice gentle but firm, carrying a warmth that contrasted the cold rain. He did not respond immediately. Words had always been difficult for him, especially with strangers. But something about her voice, its sincerity, its lack of judgment, broke through his guarded silence. Slowly, he turned his gaze toward her, and for the first time in a long while, someone held his eyes without fear, without expectation, without misunderstanding. It was an unexpected meeting, one that neither of them realized would become the beginning of a life-changing love story that would challenge social status, redefine class difference, and transform both their lives forever. She did not see a billionaire. He did not see a poor girl. What stood between them was something rare and powerful, a connection rooted in humanity, in empathy, in the quiet recognition of pain. In the days that would follow, their worlds would collide in ways neither of them could have imagined. A simple act involving a lost wallet would become a moral test of character, revealing her pure heart and unshakable values. Her humility would challenge his guarded nature, her kindness rewarded by fate in ways that would astonish even the most cynical observers. And slowly, through moments both small and profound, she would become his destiny helper, the one person capable of unlocking the emotions he had buried for years. This was not just a rich man and poor girl love story. It was an emotional transformation, a journey from brokenness to healing, from silence to expression, from isolation to connection. It was a story where faith met opportunity, where hope overcame fear, and where love proved stronger than pain. But at that moment, none of that was visible. All that existed was a young man standing in the rain and a girl offering him shelter, not just from the storm above, but from the storm within. And as he finally took a step closer under her small umbrella, something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. Because sometimes the greatest changes begin in the quietest moments. And sometimes the simplest acts carry the power to rewrite destinies. But the day she chose to sit beside his silence, she unknowingly stepped into a story that would either destroy her completely or make history. The world does not forgive what it does not understand, and he was a man no one understood. In the restless, unforgiving rhythm of Lagos City, where dominance was mistaken for strength and loudness was celebrated as confidence, there existed very little room for men who carried their battles in silence, and even less patience for those whose pain could not be translated into words that others could easily consume. Despite being a young billionaire, a man whose financial influence stretched across industries, and whose rise from a humble beginning should have inspired admiration, he was instead reduced to a puzzle that no one cared enough to solve, because society rarely invests effort into understanding what it can simply dismiss. His silence became his greatest crime, and in a world driven by performance and perception, that silence slowly transformed into a narrative that did not belong to him, but was forced upon him. People called him weak because he did not argue. They labeled him strange because he did not socialize, and they mocked him as emotionally empty because he did not display the kind of expressive energy that made others feel comfortable. Yet beneath that quiet exterior lived a storm shaped by years of poverty, family sacrifice, and emotional wounds that had never been given the space to heal. Inside the corporate world, where he was supposed to command authority as a wealthy man, he instead became the subject of subtle ridicule and quiet disrespect, because leadership in that environment was measured not only by results, but by personality, and his reserved nature failed to meet their expectations. During meetings, while others dominated conversations with aggressive confidence, he often remained still, not because he lacked ideas, but because the weight of his past had conditioned him to second-guess his voice. Every time he attempted to speak, memories of being ignored, dismissed, or misunderstood would rise within him like an invisible barrier, preventing his words from reaching the surface. This inability to defend himself verbally did not go unnoticed, and over time it became a weapon that others used against him with increasing boldness. His rivals, driven by envy of his success and threatened by his quiet resilience, began to test his limits publicly, knowing that his silence would always give them the upper hand. They interrupted him mid-sentence. They questioned his decisions with a tone of superiority, and they laughed at his pauses as though hesitation itself was proof of incompetence. "You built an empire, yet you cannot even defend it," one of them remarked during a high-stakes meeting, his voice laced with condescension as others exchanged amused glances. "How does a man like you expect to survive in a world like this?" The room filled with restrained laughter, and although no one openly declared him unfit, the message was clear: his presence was tolerated, but not respected. What made his suffering even more profound was the absence of emotional refuge in his personal life. because the same success that elevated him had also created distance between him and the people who were supposed to understand him the most. His family, who had once struggled alongside him during the darkest days of poverty, had grown disconnected from the man he had become, not because they did not care, but because they could not reconcile his quiet demeanor with the image of success they had always imagined. They had expected a son who would celebrate loudly, who would carry their pride visibly, who would embody strength in a way the world could easily recognize. Yet what they saw instead was a man who seemed trapped within himself, unable to express joy, unable to release pain, and unable to meet their expectations of what a successful life should look like. You have everything now, yet you still behave like someone who has nothing, his mother once said, her voice filled with confusion rather than cruelty, but the impact of her words cut deeply, because they echoed the same misunderstanding he faced everywhere else. He wanted to explain. He wanted to tell them that wealth had not erased his past, that success had not healed his wounds, that the boy who had endured hunger and hardship was still alive within him, carrying scars that money could not touch. But as always, the words refused to come, leaving him trapped in a cycle where silence only deepened the distance between him and the world. While his life unfolded in boardrooms and private spaces filled with unspoken tension, her life continued at the edge of that same city, grounded in simplicity yet rich in emotional depth. The poor roadside food seller, the simple girl with a pure heart, continued to serve customers from her modest roadside food shop, offering not only meals but moments of warmth that many people did not realize they needed. As a village girl shaped by hardship, she understood the language of struggle in a way that did not require words, and her experiences had nurtured within her a rare combination of humility, kindness, honesty, and unwavering integrity. Since their unexpected meeting, she had found herself paying closer attention to him, noticing patterns that others ignored, and feeling a quiet pull toward a story she did not yet fully understand. She heard the whispers that surrounded his name, the judgments that reduced his complexity to simple labels, and the warnings that discouraged any form of connection. People like him live in a different world, one customer told her one evening, his tone dismissive as he gestured toward the direction of the business district. There is too much class difference between you and him, and stories like a rich man and poor girl love story do not end well in real life. Another added with a knowing smile, focus on your work, because chasing people above your social status will only bring pain. Their words were not entirely untrue, because the gap between her world and his was vast, defined by wealth, influence, and expectations that rarely allowed such connections to survive. Yet her perspective was different, shaped not by fear, but by faith, by the belief in divine favor, and by the understanding that kindness rewarded often created outcomes that logic could not predict. The turning point came on a day that would later be remembered as the moment his fall became undeniable. At a prestigious business event designed to strengthen alliances and showcase influence, he was expected to stand as a symbol of success, a representation of what determination and resilience could achieve. Instead, the event became a stage for his most painful humiliation, orchestrated by a rival whose jealousy had grown into a calculated desire to see him fail. With deliberate timing, the rival exposed a past financial misstep, presenting it not as a minor error, but as evidence of incompetence, twisting facts in a way that shifted the perception of everyone present. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly, as admiration gave way to doubt and respect dissolved into skepticism. A man who cannot even defend his own decisions should not be trusted with yours, the rival declared, his voice carrying across the hall with confidence that bordered on arrogance. All eyes turned toward him, waiting for a response that never came. He stood there, feeling the weight of their expectations pressing against him, knowing that this was his moment to speak, to correct the narrative, to reclaim his dignity. Yet the same invisible barrier rose within him, locking his voice behind years of unresolved pain. The silence that followed was louder than any words he could have spoken, and the laughter that filled that space was not just a reaction, but a verdict. Among the observers stood the poor roadside food seller, who had arrived to deliver food, but instead found herself witnessing a moment that stirred something deep within her. As she watched him absorb the humiliation without defense, she felt a surge of emotion that went beyond sympathy, because she recognized the weight he carried and understood that his silence was not weakness, but the result of wounds that had never been given the chance to heal. In that moment, the idea of him shifted within her heart, transforming from curiosity into something more profound, something that felt like purpose. She did not see a failed leader. She saw a man in need of a destiny helper. And although the risks were undeniable, although the class difference and social status stood like barriers between them, although the world had already decided that such a connection could never lead to a happy ending, her heart refused to align with those limitations. Because sometimes an African love story does not begin with perfection, but with pain, and sometimes a touching story is not about where people start, but about how far they're willing to go for true love, emotional transformation, and the possibility of restoration. As he walked away from that gathering, carrying the weight of rejection heavier than ever before, she made a decision that would alter both of their lives in ways neither of them could yet imagine. And just when it seemed he had nothing left to lose, she did something no one had ever dared to do. Silence became his prison, but also the only place where he could still breathe. After the humiliation that echoed across Lagos City, he withdrew even further into himself, retreating into a life that was already defined by isolation, but now reinforced by a deeper sense of emotional exile. Although the world still recognized him as a young billionaire and a wealthy man, his existence no longer resembled the success people envied, because behind the guarded gates of his luxurious home lived a man who had chosen distance over disappointment, solitude over misunderstanding, and silence over the exhausting effort of trying to explain pain that no one seemed willing to understand. His mansion, vast and perfectly designed, became less of a home and more of a sanctuary where he could exist without judgment. Yet it also transformed into a quiet prison where his thoughts echoed louder than any external noise ever could. He moved through its rooms like a shadow, untouched by the luxury that surrounded him, disconnected from the very success he had built from a humble beginning shaped by poverty and relentless family sacrifice. The same determination that had elevated him into wealth had not been strong enough to heal the emotional fractures left behind by betrayal, abandonment, and loss. He rarely spoke, not because he had nothing to say, but because every attempt to express himself felt like reopening wounds that had never truly closed. His internal struggles revealed themselves not through words, but through actions that carried the weight of everything he could not voice. He would sit for hours staring at old photographs, his fingers tracing faces that no longer belonged to his present. He avoided mirrors, as though his reflection carried a truth he was not ready to confront. At night, he would walk aimlessly through his home, unable to rest, his mind replaying fragments of a past that refused to fade. There were moments when the silence felt like comfort, offering him a space where he did not have to perform, where he did not have to defend himself, where he could simply exist without expectation. But there were also moments when that same silence became suffocating, pressing against him with the weight of everything he had buried. Flashbacks came without warning, invading his solitude with painful clarity. He remembered the days when poverty had forced him to grow up faster than he should have, when hunger was not just a feeling but a daily reality, when his parents' struggles had shaped his understanding of survival. He remembered the betrayal of someone he had once trusted completely, a moment that shattered his belief in emotional security and taught him that vulnerability could be dangerous. He remembered the failures that followed, the times when he had tried to rise but had been pushed back down by circumstances beyond his control. Each memory reinforced the walls he had built around himself, making it harder for anyone to reach him, making it easier for the world to misunderstand him. Yet, in the midst of that isolation, something began to shift. The poor roadside food seller, the simple girl with unwavering kindness and quiet strength, did not disappear after witnessing his humiliation. Instead, she moved closer, not forcefully, not intrusively, but with a patience that felt almost sacred. As a village girl shaped by hardship, she understood that healing could not be rushed, that pain could not be demanded to speak, and that sometimes presence was more powerful than words. Her roadside food shop remained her world, grounded in simplicity and survival. Yet her heart carried a purpose that extended beyond her circumstances. She did not see him as a distant figure defined by social status or class difference, but as a man whose silence held a story worth understanding. To her, he was not just a wealthy man lost in his own world, but someone who needed a destiny helper, someone who could reach him without forcing him to break. She began with small gestures, acts so simple that they could easily be overlooked by anyone who did not understand their significance. Whenever he passed by, she would offer him food without expectation, placing it near him with a gentle nod rather than insisting on conversation. She never asked questions that demanded answers, never pushed him to explain himself, never tried to fill the silence that surrounded him. Instead, she respected it, treating it not as a barrier, but as a language she was willing to learn. At first, he resisted even these gestures, unsure of her intentions, conditioned by a past where kindness often came with hidden motives. But her consistency began to challenge that belief. Day after day, she showed up with the same quiet care, the same honesty, the same unwavering integrity that defined her character. There was no pressure, no expectation, no demand for reciprocation. Only presence. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, something within him began to respond. He started accepting the food she offered, not with words, but with subtle acknowledgement. He began to linger near her stall longer than necessary, not engaging in conversation, but no longer avoiding proximity. His silence remained, but it no longer felt as heavy, because it was now shared in a way that did not require explanation. Their connection grew in the spaces between words, in the quiet understanding that passed between them without the need for dialogue. It was an emotional love story unfolding without declarations, a bond forming through patience, through observation, through the simple yet powerful act of showing up. For her, this connection was not driven by expectation, but by faith, a belief that kindness rewarded would eventually reveal its purpose, that her actions were guided by divine favor, and that even the smallest gesture could become a miracle in someone's life. She did not know where this path would lead, but she trusted that it mattered. For him, this connection became a quiet refuge, a space where he did not feel judged or misunderstood, a rare experience in a world that had consistently failed to see him beyond his silence. Without realizing it, she was becoming more than just a presence in his life. She was becoming the beginning of an emotional transformation, the first step toward something he had long believed was impossible. Yet, their growing connection did not exist in isolation from the world. People began to notice. Whispers spread through the streets of Lagos City, fueled by curiosity, judgment, and the rigid expectations of social status. The idea of a rich man and poor girl love story was not seen as romantic, but as unrealistic, even dangerous. Some viewed her actions as naive, others as opportunistic, and a few as a threat to the established order of class and power. "You are getting too close to him," one customer warned her, his tone serious as he watched her from across the stall. "People like him do not belong in stories like yours, and when worlds like yours collide, it is always the weaker one that breaks." But she did not see herself as weak. She saw herself as someone who had chosen compassion over fear, someone who believed in hope, in true love, in the possibility that even the most unlikely connections could lead to something meaningful, something transformative, something capable of defying expectations. What she did not yet understand was that kindness, especially in a world divided by class difference and power, often comes with a cost. Because not everyone believed in her intentions. Not everyone welcomed her presence in his life. And not everyone was willing to let this connection grow without interference. As their silent bond deepened and her role as his unspoken support became more evident, forces beyond her control began to shift, preparing challenges that would test not only her courage, but the very foundation of her beliefs. Because in a world where power protects itself and vulnerability is often exploited, even the purest intentions can attract the darkest opposition. And just as their connection began to feel like the beginning of something beautiful, something that hinted at life-changing love, restoration, and perhaps even the distant promise of a happy ending, an unseen storm began to gather. But kindness has a price, and soon, she would be forced to pay for caring too much. Loving someone broken is easy until their pain starts breaking you too. In the ever-moving chaos of Lego City, where survival often demanded emotional distance and self-preservation, the quiet connection between a young billionaire and a poor roadside food seller had begun to draw attention in ways neither of them could control, and what once existed as a gentle, unspoken bond slowly transformed into a situation filled with pressure, judgment, and emotional weight that tested the limits of both their hearts. What had started as a simple act of kindness from a simple girl with a pure heart was now becoming something far more complicated, something that challenged social status, exposed class difference, and forced her to confront a question she had never imagined she would have to answer. For the village girl, whose life had always been grounded in humility, honesty, and unwavering integrity, love had never been about wealth or status, but about connection, about seeing someone beyond their circumstances, about believing in the possibility of emotional transformation even when the world insisted otherwise. However, the deeper she stepped into his silent world, the more she began to realize that loving someone like him required more than compassion. It required strength she was not sure she possessed. Her small roadside food shop, once a place of simple routine and quiet satisfaction, gradually became a space filled with whispers and warnings. Friends, customers, and even strangers began to express concern, not always out of malice, but out of a belief shaped by reality and experience. You are losing yourself in something that does not belong to you, one of her closest friends told her one evening, her voice heavy with concern as she watched her distracted movements. A wealthy man like him lives in a world you cannot survive in, and no matter how much faith or hope you carry, a rich man and poor girl love story rarely ends in a happy ending. Her family, who had endured years of poverty and understood the cost of survival better than anyone, reacted even more strongly. To them, her growing attachment to him felt like a dangerous distraction from the stability they had worked so hard to maintain through family sacrifice. "We did not struggle all these years for you to get involved in something that will break you," her mother said, her voice firm yet filled with fear. "Men like him do not choose girls like you, and even if they do, it is never for long. Protect your heart before it is too late." Their words were not cruel, but they were heavy, carrying the weight of truth shaped by experience. They saw the class difference, the imbalance of power, the reality of social status that often dictated how stories like hers would end. To them, she was risking everything for something uncertain, something fragile, something that could collapse at any moment. Yet her heart refused to let go so easily, because what she felt was not illusion. It was not ambition. It was not a desire for wealth or status. It was something deeper, something rooted in the quiet moments they had shared, in the silent understanding that had grown between them, in the way his presence had begun to change her just as much as hers had begun to change him. Still, the pressure began to weigh on her, slowly turning her certainty into doubt. And then came the moment that would test everything. It happened on an evening that began like any other, with the soft rhythm of daily life unfolding around her roadside food shop, the familiar sounds of Lagos blending into the background as she prepared food with the same care and dedication that defined her character. He arrived as he often did, quietly, without announcement, his presence still carrying that same silent intensity that had first drawn her attention. But something felt different. There was a heaviness in his demeanor, a distance even greater than before, as though the world had once again pushed him further into himself. She noticed it immediately, because by now she had learned to read the subtle shifts in his behavior, the small signs that revealed his internal struggles. Gathering her courage, she decided to do something she had avoided until now. She spoke, not just with gentle concern, but with emotional honesty that had been building within her for days. "You cannot keep living like this," she said, her voice steady yet filled with feeling. "I see your pain, but I cannot help you if you refuse to let me in. You do not have to face everything alone." Her words were not an attack, but an offering, a moment of vulnerability that required trust, a step beyond the silent connection they had built. But for him, it felt overwhelming. Her words touched the very part of him he had spent years protecting, the part that feared exposure, that associated vulnerability with danger, that believed opening up would only lead to more pain. Instead of responding with understanding, He withdrew further, his silence turning from quiet presence into emotional distance. He looked at her, his eyes filled with conflict, but his lips remained sealed. That silence, which had once felt safe between them, now felt like rejection. The moment stretched painfully, filled with everything that remained unsaid. "You do not trust me," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her effort to remain strong. "After everything, you still choose silence over me." He wanted to respond. He wanted to explain that it was not about trust, that it was about fear, about wounds that had not healed, about a past that still controlled his present. But as always, the words refused to come, trapped behind barriers he did not know how to break. And in that silence, misunderstanding took root. For the first time since their unexpected meeting, the connection between them cracked under the weight of unspoken emotion. What had been a source of comfort now became a source of pain. And for her, that pain felt personal because it challenged everything she believed about kindness, faith, and the idea that love, real life-changing love, could overcome even the deepest wounds. She stepped back, her heart heavy with confusion and hurt, her mind filled with the voices of those who had warned her from the beginning. Maybe they were right. Maybe this was not her story to be part of. She stood at the edge of a decision that would define her future, whether to walk away and protect herself, or to stay and continue fighting for a connection that might never fully exist. It was her moral test, a moment that would reveal not only the strength of her feelings, but the depth of her courage. Because loving him was no longer just about offering kindness. It was about enduring pain. It was about choosing uncertainty. It was about believing in something that had not yet proven itself. Tears filled her eyes as she turned away, her heart torn between love and self-preservation, between hope and reality, between the possibility of a miracle and the fear of inevitable heartbreak. And just as she took a step forward, ready to leave behind what could have been a touching story of billionaire romance, something shifted behind her. A movement, a decision, a break in the silence that had defined him for so long. And in that moment of doubt, he finally did something that changed everything. Sometimes, healing does not begin with words, but with being seen. The moment she turned away, believing that her presence no longer mattered in his world, something inside him broke through the walls he had spent years building. And for the first time since their unexpected meeting in Lagos City, the young billionaire who had been defined by silence chose action over fear, not because he suddenly found the right words, but because he could no longer bear the thought of losing the only person who had ever truly seen him beyond his pain. He reached out, not with a speech, not with explanations, but with a simple, trembling gesture that carried more meaning than any sentence he had ever failed to form, as his hand gently held hers before she could walk away completely. And in that moment, everything shifted because it was the first time he had allowed himself to be vulnerable without hiding behind silence. His grip was not forceful, but it was desperate in a quiet way, as though he was holding onto the only fragment of light left in a life that had long been overshadowed by emotional darkness. She stopped, her heart racing, her mind caught between confusion and hope, as she slowly turned to face him again, searching his eyes for answers that had always remained hidden. What she saw was not the distant, unreadable man the world had judged, but someone struggling, someone trying, someone who did not know how to speak, but was finally choosing not to run. That single moment became the first spark of something new, something fragile yet powerful, something that carried the potential for emotional transformation. It was not a complete breakthrough, but it was enough to change the direction of their story, because trust, once initiated, has a way of growing even in the most unlikely conditions. For the simple girl, the poor roadside food seller whose life had always been shaped by humility, kindness, and unwavering integrity, that moment confirmed what her heart had believed from the beginning. That beneath his silence was a man capable of connection, a man whose wounds did not define his entire being. As a village girl who had grown up understanding poverty and the value of family sacrifice, she did not need grand gestures to recognize sincerity. She only needed truth, and in that small action, she saw it clearly. From that day forward, their connection began to evolve, not through dramatic declarations, but through consistent, meaningful presence that gradually replaced uncertainty with hope. She became his emotional anchor, the one person who could sit beside him in silence without making him feel inadequate, the one person whose presence did not demand explanations, but offered understanding instead. Their bond deepened in quiet ways, in shared moments that did not require conversation, yet carried profound meaning. She would continue running her roadside food shop, and he would often sit nearby, no longer as a distant observer, but as someone slowly allowing himself to belong. People began to notice the change, the subtle shift in his demeanor, the way his once rigid isolation softened in her presence. And then, one afternoon, something unexpected happened that would introduce a new dimension to their journey. A customer, in a hurry and careless in his movements, dropped a wallet near her stall without realizing it, leaving behind not just money but important documents that could not easily be replaced. She noticed it immediately, her instinct guided by honesty and a pure heart that refused to ignore what was not hers. Without hesitation, she picked it up and began asking around, determined to return it to its rightful owner. He watched this unfold silently, observing her actions with a level of attention that revealed something deeper than curiosity. To him, this was not just a small act of responsibility. It was a moral test, a moment that highlighted the strength of her character, her unwavering commitment to doing what was right even when no one was watching. Eventually, the owner returned, frantic and worried, only to be met with relief as she handed over the wallet without expecting anything in return. The man, overwhelmed with gratitude, insisted on rewarding her, but she refused with a gentle smile, explaining that her actions were not driven by gain, but by principle. That moment stayed with him. For someone who had spent years navigating a world where trust was often compromised and motives were rarely pure, witnessing such kindness rewarded not by material gain, but by inner peace felt like encountering something rare, something almost sacred. It challenged his understanding of people, reminding him that not everyone operated with hidden intentions. It was then that he began to see something else in her, something beyond her role as a poor roadside food seller. He noticed her discipline, her ability to manage her small business despite limited resources, her understanding of people, her natural leadership within her environment. What others saw as a simple existence, he began to recognize as untapped potential. For the first time, a thought formed within him that was not rooted in fear or pain, but in possibility. He began to consider how her life could change if given the right opportunity, how her roadside food shop could evolve into something greater, how her natural skills could grow into a business that reflected her values of integrity, honesty, and kindness. This was not about charity, and it was not about obligation. It was about recognizing potential and wanting to nurture it. In his own quiet way, he began to guide her, offering small suggestions, subtle insights drawn from his experience as a wealthy man who had built success from a humble beginning. He did not overwhelm her with authority, nor did he impose his ideas, but rather shared them gently, allowing her to grow at her own pace. For her, this became more than just support. It became a sign of divine favor, a moment where her faith in goodness began to manifest in tangible ways. She did not see him as someone above her in terms of social status, but as someone walking beside her, someone who believed in her potential, someone who was becoming an unexpected part of her journey. Their story, once defined by silence and misunderstanding, was slowly transforming into something hopeful, something that resembled the beginning of a rich man and poor girl love story, not driven by fantasy, but by genuine connection and shared growth. It was becoming a touching story, one that hinted at life-changing love, at restoration, at the possibility that even the most unlikely paths could lead to something meaningful. And then, one evening, as the rain that had once symbolized his pain began to clear, a soft light broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the city. It was a quiet moment, but it carried powerful symbolism. The idea that after every storm, there is light, that after every struggle, there is the possibility of renewal. They stood there together, not speaking, yet understanding each other more than ever before, both unaware that this fragile peace was only temporary. Because hope, no matter how beautiful, is also vulnerable. And just as it began to grow, Just as their connection started to feel like the beginning of something that could lead to a happy ending, forces beyond their control began to shift once again, preparing to test everything they had built. But hope is fragile, and just as it began to grow, darkness returned stronger. The same man they once ignored was now quietly becoming unstoppable. In the ever-competitive and emotionally unforgiving environment of Lego City, where power was often mistaken for loudness and influence was measured by dominance rather than depth, the silent transformation of a young billionaire began to challenge everything people thought they knew about strength, resilience, and success. The man who had once been dismissed as weak, misunderstood as strange, and publicly humiliated for his inability to express himself had started to rise again. But this time his growth was not rooted in external validation or material success. It was driven by something far deeper, something more enduring, something that could not be easily shaken, an internal awakening fueled by connection, healing, and the unwavering presence of a destiny helper who refused to give up on him, even when the world already had. This phase of his life did not begin with dramatic announcements or sudden breakthroughs, but with quiet consistency, the kind that builds strength over time and reshapes identity without demanding attention. The wealthy man who once avoided confrontation began to return to his responsibilities with a renewed sense of purpose, approaching his work not as a burden, but as an opportunity to reclaim control over a narrative that had long been defined by misunderstanding. His presence in meetings, though still calm and measured, began to carry a different energy, one that signaled awareness, intention, and a growing confidence that could no longer be ignored. He still spoke less than others, but when he did, his words were deliberate, thoughtful, and grounded in clarity, reflecting a mind that had always been capable but had finally begun to trust itself. The same silence that had once been perceived as weakness started to feel different, no longer empty, but composed, no longer hesitant, but controlled. People began to notice, and while some struggled to accept the change, others found themselves adjusting their perception, realizing that the man they had underestimated was quietly becoming a force they could no longer dismiss. Behind this gradual rise stood the simple girl, the poor roadside food seller whose life remained rooted in poverty, yet whose spirit carried a richness that transcended material limitations. As a village girl, shaped by hardship and strengthened by family sacrifice, she understood the value of patience, the importance of humility, and the power of consistent kindness. She did not push him to become someone else, nor did she demand rapid change, but she supported his growth in a way that allowed him to evolve naturally, offering encouragement without pressure and presence without expectation. Her roadside food shop, once a symbol of survival, became a space where transformation quietly unfolded, where their connection deepened, and where the foundation of a rich man and poor girl love story continued to strengthen despite the obvious class difference and the rigid boundaries of social status. She remained grounded in her values of honesty and integrity, never allowing the changes in his life to alter her sense of self, and it was precisely this consistency that made her presence so powerful in his journey. As his confidence grew, so did his ability to make decisions that reflected both his intelligence and his evolving emotional strength. Business opportunities that once seemed uncertain began to align with greater clarity, and his leadership, though still quiet, started to command respect in ways that did not rely on force or intimidation. Deals that had been delayed due to doubt began to move forward, partnerships strengthened, and his reputation slowly shifted from questionable to admirable. This was not just financial growth. It was a form of emotional transformation that influenced every aspect of his life, allowing him to navigate challenges with a level of composure that had previously been overshadowed by fear. For the first time, he was not just surviving his past, he was rising beyond it. For her, witnessing this change was both inspiring and humbling, because it reinforced her belief in faith, in hope, and in the idea that kindness rewarded was not just a phrase but a lived reality shaped by divine favor. She saw in his progress the unfolding of something extraordinary, something that hinted at a miracle, something that suggested their connection was not accidental but purposeful. At the same time, her own life began to shift in meaningful ways. as his guidance helped her expand her small business into something more sustainable and impactful. What had once been a modest roadside food shop began to attract more customers, generate more income, and provide her with a sense of stability that had once felt impossible. This growth was not handed to her, but nurtured through effort, discipline, and the application of the insights he shared, creating a balance where both of them contributed to each other's progress. Their bond, once defined by silence, evolved into a partnership built on mutual growth, turning their story into a deeply touching story of resilience, connection, and the early stages of a billionaire romance that defied expectations. People began to notice not just his transformation, but theirs as a pair, the way they complemented each other, the way their differences did not divide them but strengthened them. However, as their progress became more visible, it also attracted attention that was far less supportive. Within his inner circle, among those who had once doubted him, there were individuals who found his transformation unsettling because it disrupted the balance of power they had grown accustomed to. His rise was no longer something they could ignore, and for some, it became something they could not accept. Among them was someone he trusted deeply, someone who had been close enough to understand his vulnerabilities, someone who had access to both his professional and personal life. This person had watched his journey from the beginning, had observed his struggles, his silence, his gradual rise, and instead of feeling inspired, had allowed jealousy to take root. The idea that someone so quiet, so underestimated, could rise beyond expectations created a resentment that slowly turned into something darker. While he focused on building a future that held the promise of life-changing love, of restoration, and perhaps one day, even a marriage proposal, followed by parents' blessing and a traditional wedding that could unite their worlds despite the odds, he remained unaware of the growing tension within his own circle. Because trust, once given, often blinds us to hidden intentions. And as he continued to rise, believing that his greatest challenges were behind him, he failed to see the storm that was quietly forming within the very space he considered safe. Because sometimes, the most dangerous betrayal does not come from enemies who stand against you openly, but from those who stand beside you, waiting for the moment when your guard is lowest and your trust is strongest. And just when success seemed within reach, betrayal struck from the closest place. Not every enemy stands far away. Some sit right beside you, smiling. In the glowing rise of his renewed life in Lego City, where progress had begun to rewrite his identity and hope had slowly replaced years of emotional silence, the young billionaire believed, perhaps for the first time, that his story was finally aligning with something meaningful, something that carried the promise of life-changing love, restoration, and a future that no longer felt haunted by the shadows of his past. However, what he failed to realize was that while he had been focused on healing, rebuilding, and trusting again, someone within his closest circle had been watching his transformation not with admiration, but with growing resentment that had quietly evolved into calculated betrayal. This person was not a distant rival or an obvious enemy, but a trusted business partner, someone who had stood beside him during critical moments, someone who had gained access to his decisions, his vulnerabilities, and the structure of the empire he had built from a humble beginning shaped by poverty and relentless family sacrifice. To the outside world, this partnership represented strength, unity, and strategic brilliance. But beneath that surface existed a hidden fracture fueled by jealousy, insecurity, and the inability to accept that the man once perceived as weak was now rising beyond control. While the wealthy man continued to grow with quiet determination, supported by the unwavering presence of the simple girl whose kindness, honesty, and integrity had become his emotional foundation, his partner began to execute a plan that would dismantle everything from within. Financial decisions were manipulated, investments were redirected, and critical information was withheld, all designed to create a collapse that would appear as failure rather than betrayal. The downfall began subtly, almost invisibly, with minor inconsistencies that did not immediately raise alarm. Small financial discrepancies appeared in reports. Partnerships began to withdraw without clear explanation, and projects that once showed promise suddenly faced unexpected obstacles. At first, he attempted to address these issues with the same calm focus that had defined his recent growth, believing that challenges were a natural part of success. But as the situation escalated, it became impossible to ignore the pattern. Losses began to multiply, not just financially, but structurally, as the foundation of his business empire started to weaken under the weight of decisions he had not fully authorized. The trust he had placed in his partner became the very tool used against him, turning collaboration into vulnerability and loyalty into exposure. When the truth finally surfaced, it did not arrive gently. It came as a revelation that shattered everything he had begun to rebuild. The person he had trusted had not only betrayed him financially, but had also manipulated situations to damage his reputation, spreading doubt among investors and reinforcing the narrative that he was incapable of leading effectively. It was not just a loss of money. It was a calculated attack on his identity, his progress, and the fragile confidence he had worked so hard to develop. The impact was devastating. For a man whose greatest struggle had always been emotional expression, this betrayal struck at the core of his ability to trust, reopening wounds that had never fully healed. The silence he had begun to overcome returned with greater intensity, not as a place of calm, but as a retreat into isolation, a defense mechanism against a world that once again proved itself unsafe. He withdrew completely. The progress he had made, the confidence he had built, the connection he had nurtured, all of it seemed to collapse under the weight of this single betrayal. The young billionaire who had been rising quietly became a shadow of himself once more, retreating into the same patterns of silence and distance that had once defined his existence. For the village girl, the poor roadside food seller who had become his destiny helper, this moment marked the beginning of her greatest challenge. She watched as the man she had believed in, the man whose emotional transformation had inspired her, began to fade back into the darkness he had once fought so hard to escape. The strength she had helped nurture now seemed fragile, threatened by a pain that ran deeper than anything she had witnessed before. Her roadside food shop, once a symbol of stability and growth, became a place where her thoughts were consumed by worry, where her focus shifted from survival to preservation, not of her business, but of the connection she feared was slipping away. She tried to reach him, to remind him of how far he had come, to anchor him in the reality of his progress. But this time, the silence felt different. It was heavier, more distant, more final. The man who had once held her hand in a moment of vulnerability now seemed unreachable, as though the betrayal had locked him behind walls even stronger than before. Her kindness, her faith, her unwavering hope, all the qualities that had once brought light into his life, now felt as though they were being tested beyond their limits. Friends and family, who had already questioned her involvement in this rich man and poor girl love story, intensified their warnings. "This is what we feared," her mother said, her voice filled with concern as she watched her daughter struggle emotionally. "You're trying to hold together something that is breaking you. You cannot save someone who refuses to fight for himself." Their words carried weight, because for the first time, doubt began to enter her heart. She had always believed that true love, guided by faith and strengthened by divine favor, could overcome any obstacle, that even the most difficult journeys could lead to a miracle, a happy ending where kindness rewarded would prevail over hardship. But now, faced with a reality that seemed to contradict everything she believed, she found herself questioning whether her love was enough. The class difference between them, once a challenge she was willing to face, now felt like an additional barrier, amplifying the complexity of a situation that was already overwhelming. He was a wealthy man with responsibilities, pressures, and expectations that she could not fully navigate, while she remained a simple girl, grounded in a world where problems were solved through effort and resilience, not corporate battles and financial warfare. Yet, despite the growing uncertainty, she refused to abandon him. Because for her, this was not just a story of romance. It was an American-African love story, a touching story of connection, sacrifice, and belief, one that had the potential to redefine what people thought was possible, one that could still lead to restoration, to gratitude, to a future where even the darkest moments would become part of a journey toward healing. She continued to show up. She continued to offer presence. She continued to believe. But belief alone could not undo betrayal. As the financial damage deepened and his emotional withdrawal intensified, the reality became impossible to ignore. The situation was slipping beyond her control, and the man she loved was losing himself once again, not to silence alone, but to a pain that threatened to erase everything they had built together. And this time, even her love might not be enough to save him. There comes a moment when even the strongest hearts consider giving up. In the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of Lagos City, where ambition once fueled his rise and hope had briefly illuminated his path, everything now felt consumed by darkness so deep that even memory struggled to recall what light had once looked like. The young billionaire, who had fought silently to rebuild himself after years of poverty, family sacrifice, and emotional wounds, now stood at the edge of a collapse that felt far more devastating than anything he had experienced before. Because this time, it was not just his past haunting him, it was his present falling apart in real time. The betrayal had not only dismantled his financial stability, but had also shattered the fragile trust he had begun to rebuild through his connection with the simple girl, the poor roadside food seller whose presence had once felt like a miracle in a life defined by isolation. What had once been the foundation of his emotional transformation was now overshadowed by doubt, fear, and a return to the silence that had always served as both his refuge and his prison. He retreated completely, not gradually, not reluctantly, but entirely, as though the weight of everything had finally become too much to carry. The mansion that once symbolized success and later became a space of quiet healing now turned into a place of emptiness, where every room echoed with absence and every corner reflected a man who no longer recognized himself. He stopped attending meetings, ignored calls, and withdrew from every responsibility that once defined his identity as a wealthy man. The world outside continued to move, but he no longer felt part of it. His silence deepened, becoming heavier than ever before, no longer just a shield against pain, but a complete surrender to it. The progress he had made, the confidence he had slowly built, the connection he had nurtured, all of it seemed to dissolve under the weight of betrayal, leaving behind a void that felt impossible to fill. The storm outside seemed to mirror the storm within him. Rain fell relentlessly, dark clouds covering the sky as though the city itself was mourning a loss that no one else could see. The same rain that had once symbolized his pain now returned with greater intensity, reflecting a reality where everything felt lost, where hope seemed distant, where even the idea of recovery felt unrealistic. For the village girl, the emotional impact was equally devastating. The rich man and poor girl love story she had believed in, the connection she had nurtured with unwavering kindness, faith, and hope, now felt as though it was slipping beyond her reach. She continued to stand beside him, to show up, to offer the same presence that had once sparked change, but this time, it felt different. This time, it felt like she was standing alone. Her roadside food shop, once a place of warmth and quiet joy, became a reflection of her internal struggle, where her movements lacked the energy they once carried, and her smile felt forced against the weight of uncertainty. Customers noticed the change, the absence of the vibrant spirit that had once defined her, but few understood the depth of what she was facing. Her family's concerns grew stronger, their warnings more urgent. "You are losing yourself trying to save someone who has already given up," her mother said, her voice filled with both love and frustration. "You cannot carry his pain and your own at the same time. This is not what we sacrificed for. This is not the future we imagined for you." Their words echoed in her mind, not because they lacked truth, but because they challenged everything she believed about true love, about kindness rewarded, about the idea that even the most broken situations could lead to restoration through divine favor. For the first time, she began to question herself. Was she holding on to something that was already gone? Was her belief in him stronger than his belief in himself? Was this connection, this touching story, destined to end not in a happy ending, but in heartbreak that could not be undone? The weight of these questions became unbearable, pulling her into an emotional space she had never experienced before, where hope and doubt coexisted in painful tension. One evening, as the storm outside intensified, she found herself standing alone in her small room, the sound of rain echoing against the roof as though reflecting the chaos within her. She thought about everything: their unexpected meeting, The moments of silent understanding, the small victories, the glimpses of a future that once felt possible. She thought about the way he had held her hand, the way that single gesture had changed everything. And now, she thought about the distance, the silence, the absence. Tears filled her eyes as she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had been trying to hold together. For someone who had always been strong, always resilient, always guided by faith, this moment felt like the breaking point. Because loving him had become more than just an act of compassion. It had become a sacrifice, and she was no longer sure if she had anything left to give. Meanwhile, in his isolated world, he sat in darkness, surrounded by the ruins of everything he had built, not just financially, but emotionally. His mind replayed the betrayal over and over, each detail reinforcing the belief that trust was a mistake, that vulnerability was dangerous, that opening up had only led to deeper pain. He thought about her, about the way she had entered his life without expectation, about the way she had seen him when no one else did, about the way she had become his anchor, his destiny helper, his connection to something real. And yet, even that thought felt distant now, overshadowed by the fear that he had already lost her, that his inability to hold on to anything meaningful had finally taken its toll. The silence consumed him completely. Everything felt empty. Everything felt final. The storm raged on, both outside and within, creating a moment where it seemed as though nothing could survive the weight of what they were experiencing. It was the lowest point, the place where even the strongest hearts begin to consider giving up, where the idea of continuing feels heavier than the idea of letting go. And just when it seemed like there was nothing left to hold on to, when both of them stood on the edge of emotional collapse, something unexpected began to surface. A truth, a hidden piece of his past, something that had never been revealed, something that carried the power to redefine everything she thought she understood about him, about his silence, about his pain. Because sometimes, what looks like weakness is actually protection. Sometimes, what feels like distance is actually fear. And sometimes, the truth we need the most is the one that has been hidden the longest, until one unexpected truth surfaced and changed the meaning of his silence forever. His silence was never weakness. It was survival. The storm that had consumed both their lives did not end with thunder or rain, but with a quiet revelation that carried more power than any chaos that had come before it. And in the dim stillness of that moment, the truth that had been buried for years finally began to surface, not as a dramatic confession, but as a fragile unveiling of a past that explained everything the world had misunderstood about the young billionaire who had spent most of his life hiding behind silence. It happened in the only way it could have happened, with her presence, unwavering despite the pain, despite the doubt, despite the emotional exhaustion that had pushed her to the edge of walking away. The simple girl, the poor roadside food seller, the village girl whose strength came from faith, humility, and a pure heart, chose to return one more time, not with expectations, not with demands, but with a quiet determination to understand what no one else had ever taken the time to see. She entered his world not as someone trying to fix him, but as someone willing to sit in his darkness until light revealed itself. And for the first time since the betrayal that had shattered him, something shifted in the way he looked at her, as though her presence reminded him of a truth he had been trying to forget, that not everyone who comes close intends to hurt, and not every connection ends in destruction. What followed was not easy, and it was not immediate, because breaking years of emotional restraint required more than a single moment of courage. But slowly, through gestures, through fragments of expression, through a vulnerability that felt unfamiliar and terrifying, he began to reveal the truth behind his silence. His past was not just a story of poverty and family sacrifice, although those struggles had shaped him deeply, but a series of emotional wounds that had taught him, repeatedly, that speaking his truth only led to pain. As a child, he had grown up in an environment where expressing emotion was met with dismissal, where vulnerability was treated as weakness, and where survival depended on endurance rather than communication. He had watched his parents struggle, not just financially, but emotionally, carrying burdens they never spoke about, teaching him without words that pain was something to be endured quietly rather than shared. When he tried to express his fears, his confusion, his sadness, he was often met with silence or correction, not out of cruelty, but out of a belief that strength meant suppression. Then came the betrayal that changed everything. As he grew older and began to rise from his humble beginning, building the foundation that would eventually make him a wealthy man, he placed his trust in someone he believed understood him, someone who promised partnership, loyalty, and shared success. That trust was broken in a way that left scars deeper than financial loss. As his vulnerability was used against him, his openness exploited, and his belief in connection shattered completely. From that moment, silence became his shield. It was not that he did not feel, and it was not that he did not want to express himself, but that he had learned, through experience, that speaking could lead to loss, that trusting could lead to betrayal, and that protecting himself required distance. His silence was not emptiness. It was defense, a carefully constructed barrier designed to prevent further damage in a world that had repeatedly proven itself unsafe. As he revealed this truth, not in perfect words but in broken pieces, in pauses, in expressions that carried more meaning than language, she listened with a depth of understanding that went beyond sympathy, because for the first time, she saw him completely, not as the man society had judged, not as the silent figure people misunderstood, but as someone who had been surviving in the only way he knew how. Tears filled her eyes, not out of pity, but out of recognition, because his story resonated with her own experiences of struggle, of navigating poverty, of witnessing family sacrifice, of understanding that survival often required choices that others could not comprehend. In that moment, everything changed. Her confusion turned into clarity. Her doubt transformed into certainty. Her pain reshaped into purpose. She no longer saw his silence as distance, but as protection. She no longer felt rejected by his inability to speak, but understood it as a reflection of wounds that needed patience rather than pressure. The connection between them, once fragile and uncertain, became grounded in truth, in understanding, in a shared awareness that what they had was not ordinary. It was something deeper, something that carried the potential for true, emotional transformation. For him, this moment marked a turning point he had never believed possible. For the first time, he felt seen without being judged, understood without being questioned, accepted without needing to change who he was. The simple girl who had entered his life through an unexpected meeting had become more than just a presence. She had become his mirror, his anchor, his destiny helper, someone who reflected back a version of himself that he had long believed was lost. Strength began to return, not as a sudden surge, but as a quiet rebuilding of confidence, as a realization that perhaps his past did not have to define his future, that perhaps trust could exist without leading to betrayal, that perhaps love, real, life-changing love, was not something to fear, but something to embrace carefully, intentionally, and with courage. Their story, once overshadowed by misunderstanding and pain, began to take on a new form, one that resembled the deeper layers of an African love story, a touching story where connection was not built on perfection, but on truth, resilience, and the willingness to grow together despite the odds. The rich man and poor girl love story that others had dismissed now carried the weight of authenticity, challenging the limitations of social status and proving that class difference could not define the depth of human connection. She stood beside him, not as someone trying to change him, but as someone who believed in who he was becoming, someone who saw beyond his past and into the potential of a future that could hold restoration, gratitude, and even the distant possibility of a happy ending shaped by kindness rewarded and guided by divine favor. And as the storm within him began to settle, replaced by a quiet but growing strength, something new ignited, a determination not just to survive, but to rise, to reclaim everything that had been taken from him, to rebuild not only his empire, but his identity, his voice, and his place in the world. This was no longer just about healing. It was about becoming unstoppable. And with that truth, a new fire was ignited, one the world was not ready for. This time, they were not rebuilding from hope, but from truth. The atmosphere of Lagos City had not changed, because it was still a place where people judged quickly, where social status defined respect, and where power often determined whose story was believed, but what had changed completely was the man standing within it. Because the young billionaire who once moved through life as a shadow of his own potential was now returning not with uncertainty or silent fear, but with a grounded sense of clarity that had been forged through pain, revelation, and the kind of understanding that could not be shaken easily again. This time, his rebuilding was different, because it was no longer driven by the fragile energy of hope alone, but by truth, by awareness, by the deep realization that his silence had never been his weakness, and that his journey was not about becoming someone else, but about becoming fully himself without fear of judgment or rejection. The betrayal that had once nearly destroyed him was now being transformed into a foundation for strength, because instead of allowing it to define his downfall, he chose to study it, to understand where trust had been misplaced, where decisions had been influenced by emotion rather than clarity, and where his own patterns of withdrawal had created vulnerabilities that others had exploited. This level of reflection did not come easily, and it did not come without moments of doubt, but it marked the beginning of a strategic comeback that would soon challenge everything the world believed about him. Beside him stood the simple girl, the poor roadside food seller whose presence had evolved from quiet support into an essential force of stability, someone whose kindness, honesty, and integrity continue to shape not only his emotional growth, but also his practical decisions. As a village girl who had grown through poverty and family sacrifice, she understood resilience in a way that did not require explanation, and her unwavering belief in faith, in divine favor, and in the idea of kindness rewarded gave him a sense of grounding that he had never experienced before. Their connection, once fragile and uncertain, now carried a different energy, one built on truth, mutual understanding, and a shared determination to move forward despite everything that had tried to break them. The rich man and poor girl love story that others had doubted was now becoming something undeniable, a deeply touching story of growth, endurance, and the kind of emotional transformation that redefines both individuals and the world around them. He returned to his business world not with noise, but with precision, carefully restructuring what had been damaged, identifying the gaps created by betrayal, and making decisions that reflected both his intelligence and his newfound emotional clarity. He worked tirelessly, often through long nights, rebuilding partnerships, restoring trust with investors, and slowly reclaiming the ground that had been lost. This process required more than skill, because it demanded resilience, the ability to face the same environment that had once humiliated him, the courage to stand before people who had doubted him, and the strength to continue despite the lingering fear that failure could happen again. Each meeting, each negotiation, each decision became a test, not only of his professional ability, but of his emotional growth. For the first time, he did not avoid these tests. He faced them. His voice, though still calm and measured, began to carry a weight that commanded attention, because it was no longer held back by fear, but guided by clarity. People who had once dismissed him now found themselves listening, not out of obligation, but out of recognition that something had changed in a way that could not be ignored. Public perception began to shift. The man who had been seen as weak was now being recognized as composed. The silence that had once been mocked was now understood as control, and the presence that had once been overlooked was now commanding respect. His rise was no longer quiet in the eyes of the world, because results began to speak in ways that no argument ever could. At the same time, her life continued to evolve alongside his, as her roadside food shop grew into something far beyond its original purpose, reflecting the same principles of honesty, humility, and dedication that had always defined her character. With his guidance and her effort, what had once been a simple means of survival became a symbol of growth, a testament to what could happen when opportunity met integrity. Their journey together became an example of what many had once dismissed as impossible, an African love story that challenged class difference and redefined the limitations of social status, proving that connection rooted in truth could transcend boundaries that society often treated as permanent. People began to talk again, but this time their tone had changed. "What they have is real," some whispered, watching from a distance as their lives continued to intertwine. "It is not just a story of wealth or struggle. It is something deeper, others admitted, recognizing that their connection carried a meaning that could not be reduced to simple labels. Yet, despite the growing recognition, the journey was far from easy, because success, especially when it follows failure, attracts attention that is not always supportive. For him, every step forward required confronting the fear that still lingered beneath the surface, the memories of betrayal that occasionally resurfaced, and the internal voice that questioned whether he could sustain this growth. But this time, he did not face those fears alone, because she remained by his side, offering the same steady presence that had guided him through his darkest moments. Her belief in him never wavered, even when challenges arose, even when progress felt slow, even when doubt attempted to return. She continued to remind him, not with words alone, but with her actions, that his journey was not defined by his past, but by his choices moving forward. Together, they rebuilt not just a business, but a life, one that carried the promise of life-changing love, of restoration, and the distant yet growing possibility of a future that could include a marriage proposal, the joy of parents' blessing, and the beauty of a traditional wedding that would unite their worlds in a way that once seemed impossible. Their story was no longer about survival. It was about becoming. And as their progress became more visible, as their influence began to grow, as their presence started to shape conversations beyond their immediate world, something else began to emerge. Attention. Not all of it positive. Because in a world where power, jealousy, and hidden motives often operate beneath the surface, success does not only attract admiration. It attracts resistance. It attracts those who feel threatened. It attracts those who are not ready to accept change. And just as they began to feel the stability of their rebuilt lives, just as the idea of a happy ending started to feel within reach, the reality of their situation reminded them that every rise comes with new challenges, new risks, and new tests that could either strengthen them further or attempt to break them once again. But success attracts attention, and not all of it is good. The man who once couldn't speak his pain was now being heard by the entire world. In the vibrant, ever-evolving heart of Lagos City, where stories rise and fall with the rhythm of ambition and survival, a transformation unfolded so powerfully that it reshaped not only one man's destiny, but the perception of everyone who had once doubted him, misunderstood him, or dismissed him entirely. The young billionaire who had once stood silently in the rain, carrying invisible wounds that no one cared to understand, had now risen into a figure whose presence commanded global attention, not because he had changed who he was, but because he had finally embraced it with strength, clarity, and purpose. His success was no longer quiet. It was undeniable. The empire he rebuilt from the ruins of betrayal had grown stronger than before, not just in financial value, but in structure, vision, and resilience. Every decision he made reflected lessons learned through pain. Every partnership was chosen with intention, and every step forward carried the weight of experience that could not be faked or borrowed. He was no longer just a wealthy man. He had become a symbol of restoration, of what it means to fall completely and rise again with greater strength. The world that had once mocked his silence now listened when he spoke, because when he finally began to express himself, it was not with unnecessary noise or empty confidence, but with a calm authority that carried depth, truth, and emotional power. His voice, once trapped behind years of fear and misunderstanding, now reached beyond boardrooms into public spaces, interviews, and gatherings where his story inspired others who had faced their own battles in silence. Yet, what made his transformation truly remarkable was not just his financial success, but the emotional growth that accompanied it. This was not simply a billionaire romance story of wealth and status. It was an emotional love story of healing, connection, and the power of true love to unlock parts of a person that the world had long believed were unreachable. At the center of this transformation stood the simple girl, the poor roadside food seller whose life had once revolved around a modest roadside food shop, grounded in poverty, yet rich in kindness, honesty, and unwavering integrity. As a village girl shaped by family sacrifice and strengthened by faith, she had entered his life without expectation, guided only by compassion and the belief that even the most broken hearts deserved understanding. Their unexpected meeting had become the foundation of a journey that neither of them could have predicted. evolving into a rich man and poor girl love story that challenged class difference and redefined the boundaries of social status. What began as a quiet connection had grown into something powerful, something that embodied life-changing love, something that proved that kindness rewarded was not just an idea, but a reality shaped by divine favor. As his success reached new heights, moments of emotional reunion began to unfold, bringing closure to parts of his life that had once been defined by distance and misunderstanding. His family, who had struggled to understand him in the past, now saw him clearly for the first time, not just as a successful man, but as someone who had endured, who had grown, who had found balance between strength and vulnerability. Their reconciliation was not dramatic, but it was deeply meaningful, built on mutual recognition of past struggles and a shared desire to move forward with gratitude and understanding. The wounds that once created distance began to heal, replaced by a sense of connection that felt more authentic than anything they had experienced before. Society, too, shifted in its perception. The same people who had once whispered doubts now spoke with admiration. The same voices that had mocked his silence now acknowledged his strength, and the same environment that had once rejected him now celebrated his success. He had become more than just a businessman. He had become an example of what it means to overcome internal and external battles without losing oneself in the process. For her, watching this transformation was both emotional and humbling, because she knew that his success was not just his own, it was the result of a journey they had walked together, a reflection of the moments she had chosen to stay when leaving would have been easier, a testament to the power of believing in someone even when they could not believe in themselves. Their relationship deepened further, evolving into a partnership that balanced love with respect, ambition with grounding, and growth with stability. Conversations about the future became more real, more intentional, carrying the possibility of a marriage proposal, the warmth of parents' blessing, and the beauty of a traditional wedding that would unite their worlds in a way that once seemed impossible. Their story had become a touching story, an African love story that resonated beyond their personal lives, inspiring others to believe in the possibility of connection beyond circumstances, to trust and hope, to embrace faith, and to understand that even the most unlikely journeys can lead to a happy ending when guided by truth and resilience. And yet, within all this success, recognition, and emotional fulfillment, there remained a question that lingered quietly beneath the surface, a question that neither the world nor even he himself could fully answer. Because while his rise was undeniable, while his transformation was real, while his success was deserved, it had not happened in isolation. It had been shaped by influence, by presence, by moments that could easily have been overlooked, by a destiny helper whose role in his journey went far beyond what anyone could see from the outside. As he stood at the peak of his success, surrounded by recognition, respect, and the fulfillment of a life he had once believed impossible, his gaze often returned to the one person who had been there from the beginning, the one who had seen him when he was invisible, the one who had believed in him when belief seemed unreasonable. And in that quiet reflection, a deeper realization began to take form. Because every great rise carries a hidden foundation, every powerful transformation has an unseen force behind it, and every story of triumph holds a truth that goes beyond the individual at its center. But the real question remained, who was the true architect of his rise? Not every hero makes noise. Some change lives in silence. In the quiet aftermath of a journey that had transformed pain into purpose and silence into strength, the story of the young billionaire and the poor roadside food seller settled into something deeper than success, something beyond recognition, something that could not be measured by wealth, applause, or societal validation. Because what they had built together was not just a life. It was meaning, it was healing, it was a living testament to the power of true love, faith, and the quiet, unwavering force of kindness that changes destinies without ever demanding attention. The rain that had once followed him like a shadow, symbolizing his internal storms and unspoken pain, no longer fell with the same intensity, because now it carried a different meaning, one of calm, of renewal, of a journey that had moved from chaos to clarity. Where once he stood alone, soaked in silence and misunderstood by a world that saw only his surface, he now stood grounded, not because the storms had disappeared completely, but because he had learned how to stand within them without losing himself. And, at the center of that transformation, there was her. The simple girl, the village girl, the poor roadside food seller who had once stood behind a modest roadside food shop in the bustling streets of Lagos City, living a life shaped by poverty, family sacrifice, and the quiet discipline of survival, yet carrying within her a wealth that no money could replicate, a heart rooted in humility, honesty, integrity, and a belief in people that refused to be broken even by the harshest realities of life. She had not entered his life with a plan. She had not sought a wealthy man, nor had she imagined herself becoming part of a rich man and poor girl love story that would challenge class difference and redefine social status. She had simply chosen to care, and in that choice, she became something far greater than she ever intended to be. She became his destiny helper. She became the reason silence began to speak. She became the quiet force behind a transformation that the world would later celebrate as a miracle, a journey of restoration, of emotional transformation, of rising from a humble beginning into a life that carried purpose, impact, and the undeniable presence of divine favor. Her role was never loud. It was never dramatic. It was never designed for recognition, but it was real. In every moment, she chose patience over frustration. In every act of kindness that expected nothing in return, in every decision where she held on to faith, even when doubt tried to take its place, she was shaping a future that neither of them could fully see at the time. The world would later look at him and see success, a young billionaire who had overcome betrayal, reclaimed his place, and built an empire stronger than before, a man whose voice now carried influence and whose story inspired countless others. They would speak of his resilience, his intelligence, his ability to rise again after falling, and they would celebrate his journey as one of strength and determination. But what many would not fully understand was the quiet truth behind that success. Because behind every visible rise, there is an invisible foundation. And in his story, that foundation was her. The girl who returned the lost wallet without expecting reward, passing a silent moral test that revealed her pure heart. The girl who stood beside him when he had nothing to offer but silence. The girl who believed in him when belief seemed unreasonable. The girl who turned a moment of unexpected meeting into a lifetime of impact. This was not just a billionaire romance. This was a touching story of connection, of sacrifice, of growth, and of the kind of life-changing love that does not demand perfection, but creates it through patience and truth. As their journey continued, the future they had once only imagined began to take form, carrying the promise of a marriage proposal, the warmth of parents' blessing, and the beauty of a traditional wedding that would unite their worlds not as opposites, but as complements, proving that love is not limited by circumstance, but defined by commitment. Their story became an African love story that resonated far beyond Lagos City, inspiring others to believe that even in a world divided by wealth, status, and expectation, connection rooted in truth could still thrive, that even in the face of poverty and hardship, hope could still lead to something extraordinary, and that even the most broken individuals could find healing through the presence of someone who chooses to stay. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all was this: that kindness rewarded is not always immediate, and it is not always visible, but it has a way of shaping outcomes that no amount of power or strategy can replicate. That honesty and integrity, even when they seem small, carry the strength to rebuild lives. That faith and hope, when held consistently, can turn the impossible into reality. And that sometimes the most powerful transformations do not come from grand actions, but from quiet decisions made consistently over time. As the rain softened into a gentle calm, reflecting a journey that had moved from storm to peace, their story stood as a reminder that not all heroes stand on stages, and not all victories are announced with noise. Some are lived, some are felt, some are built in silence. And as the world continued to celebrate the man he had become, those who truly understood the depth of his journey knew that his success was not just his own, but the result of a connection that had redefined both their lives. Because in the end, it was never just about wealth. It was about healing, It was about love. It was about becoming. Sometimes, the greatest love stories are not spoken. They are felt, endured, and quietly rewritten into greatness. If this story touched even the quietest part of your heart, then please like this video, because sometimes one simple click helps stories of love, pain, and restoration reach someone who is silently suffering. Tell me in the comments, was she just a poor roadside food seller? Or was she the destiny helper God sent to rebuild a broken man the world had thrown away? And be honest, would you have stayed beside him when his silence started hurting you too? Or would you have walked away before love destroyed you? Subscribe to this channel for more shocking, emotional African love stories where poverty meets destiny, kindness changes lives, and true love survives betrayal. Share this story with someone who still believes that the right heart can turn pain into purpose and silence into greatness.